Welcome to the Big L, your unofficial source for Libertarian Party news, arcana, and information for the liberty-minded political junkie. Find us at BigLPodcast.com. Here's your host, Libertarian Party insider and the pink flame of liberty, Caryn Ann.
All right, and welcome to the Big L podcast. This is episode 7, which is part 3 of the series Replatforming the Libertarian Party. And as I promised, we will get right into it. Well, almost right into it. These for the feed will be spaced out a week apart. So if anyone is wondering why I have not mentioned you, if you have become a patron or left an iTunes review, it's because I recorded these all on one day and it hasn't happened yet. And, you know, I may be like fantastically awesome, but I don't yet have a crystal ball. So here we go, getting right into the subject matter of the changes that were made to the platform in 2018 and why they are so important, which I think you'll see for yourself, knowing all the things that we talked about leading up to this to give the proper foundation. I'll go through them in the order that they were adopted, and perhaps we'll talk about some that were not adopted and, you know, things like that. As always, appropriate links will be included in the show notes. And one of those links will be to the Platform Committee report for 2018. I'll be referring to that by page numbers. If you want to follow along, you'll get a whole lot more out of this, I think, if you're looking at the document. But even just listening, you'll get something out of it. You just might not be able to visualize as well what I'm talking about. First, go to page 38. This was the first item taken up. It was taken up out of order. The convention felt it was that important, and it was to amend Plank 3.4, which is entitled Free Trade and Migration. And the amendment that was passed out of committee was to delete the final sentence. So here it is with the final sentence. We support the removal of governmental impediments to free trade, political freedom, and escape from tyranny demand that individuals not be unreasonably constrained by government in the crossing of political boundaries. Economic freedom demands the unrestricted movement of human as well as financial capital across national borders. However, we support control over the entry into our country of foreign nationals who pose a credible threat to security, health, or property. We struck that last sentence, and that, I think, was absolutely needed. In the past platforms, there was nothing like this. They were very explicit to the point of saying that we don't even believe in passports. One of the things that's kind of Republican lighted the platform. Not that everyone who liked that line wanted that or took it that way. That is, in fact, the result of it. And so many times people would point to that sentence to argue that the party or the libertarian position, at least as the Libertarian Party sees it, is not open borders. And it is. This is one of the things that was confusing people. But what some people are getting more confused by isn't by the platform, it's by the idea of what open borders even means. A lot of people get it, but other people think it means you can absolutely never keep somebody from coming. And that's not true. Because in all of these freedoms, there is always the presupposition that a threat, a credible threat, an imminent threat, an actual threat, not a theoretical one, can be repelled. That is part of the whole non-aggression principle. Of course, that would be very narrow circumstances. So it isn't a free-for-all where if we saw somebody coming in, you know, with a bomb strapped to their body, yelling, "I'm going to kill everyone," that they couldn't be stopped. Why did we feel in this particular platform plank to have to explicitly say, yeah, but we can repel credible threats? It was a dog whistle. And in this day of Trump, the last thing we needed in our platform was that kind of dog whistle. With or without that sentence, credible threats to anything, credible threats in the exercise of any rights is something that can be defended against. We do not need to add that caveat to any plank. The only times we need to add it is when someone could construe us as advocating for violence. For instance, there were old platforms where we discussed revolutionary groups, and we needed to make sure that we were talking about peaceful revolutions. That is understandable. But there is nothing in here, unless you presume that immigrants are coming here to do us harm, to make this so explicit. Further, this sentence was used even farther than, just, hey, this guy's got a bomb and we don't want to let him in. In fact, there have been people in the past on the LNC who took this sentence to mean we can control immigration if we think that person might ever in the future end up on welfare, because that's a credible threat to property. And that is way beyond what this ever was intended to mean. By that logic, there should be a way that you should be able to wealth screen people who want to have children, because having children that might go on welfare, they're threatening your property, right? It's absolutely ridiculous. Some of the things people will go through just on the immigration question. And I think it reveals a deeper problem that we have. The statists have done a great job at making us scared of the other. And as the party enters its 50th year, we need to stop being so desperate for everyone to like us and not be offended that we'll lift our skirts to any bad idea. No, we need to stop that. People, as we should see by Trump, actually, I'm going to use Trump as an example here, that, believe me, I am no fan of that guy, but one thing I think he proved is that people are attracted to confident expression of your ideas. Unfortunately, most of his are awful ideas. Our ideas are great ideas. We need to confidently, clearly, and unapologetically declare them. But unapologetically does not mean unempathetically, and that is also a big problem that we have in the party. Next item to be taken up was Proposal AA, which was presented to the delegates in a supplement to the Platform Committee report, which is also linked in the show notes. This involved a deletion and a addition of sentences in Plank 1.6 parental rights. It read, before the changes, parents or other guardians have the right to raise their children according to their own standards and beliefs. This statement shall not be construed to condone child abuse. What passed is that last sentence, the statement shall not be construed to condone child abuse or neglect, was struck as awkward and kind of telling people how they were required to read something. It was a bit directive, or in other words, a bit bossy to some people. And it just was kind of odd. It was imperious, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So that sentence was struck, and instead this phrase was added to the previous statement, provided that the rights of children to be free from abuse and neglect are also protected. That is much clearer and doesn't tell people how they are required to read something. If something was perhaps so unclear that you have to tell them how to read it, a rewording might be better in order. And that is what was done. Next, if you go to page 4 of the main report, this was a proposal to add a new plank, licensing, to the current Section 2 after the plank that was already numbered 2.7. As follows. Libertarians support the right of every person to earn an honest and peaceful living through the free and voluntary exchange of goods and services. Accordingly, we oppose occupational and other licensing laws that infringe on this right or treat it as a state-granted privilege. We encourage certifications by voluntary associations of professionals. That's entirely new. That was a big gaping hole in our platform before. And this is something I really wanted to get done, and it got done. And before we move into the next item, a short word needs to be said about minority reports, which was something, I don't want to say a controversy because that would make it more than it actually was. But there was some confusion over minority reports because the convention rules, or is it in the bylaws, whatever, our rules provide that a certain number of platform committee members can join together in a minority report. And it does not limit it to just one group. The language is ambiguous, and to limit it to just one would seem to go over the rights of the other folks who might want to submit a minority report. And it seems to defeat in its entirety, if you say it's the minority report with the most signers to it, to have, any 4 members or whatever it might be. It should be any majority minority members type of thing, but it wasn't. So it was decided by the delegates to let planks that had multiple minority reports, to let the minority reports be heard. I'm not going to go through how they decided between them. Just wanted to note that when you look at this report, you will see that there were some multiple minority reports. But as I told you, we ended up with the current statement of principles that we have now through them fielding not just, I think they were freaking out because we had 3 minority reports on some of these. That was 7 or 8? So that's definitely the tradition in the party, and I'm really in favor of it. Why should not the delegates hear different ways to look at this particular issue? And I think it really does protect the right of minority voices. And in most platform committees in the past decade, that have been the more radical libertarians. On this particular committee, the two were pretty evenly balanced, but it will also protect the moderates in the event of some runaway radical committee. It protects everyone. It is something that I am highly in favor of. And if the bylaws or rules are unclear, then let's amend them. But until then, I think it allows it. And that's exactly what happened at that convention. So go to page 5. The next item that passed was to amend and split current plank 2.4 government finance and spending. The current plank grouped 2 subjects together, government debt and government spending. And the proposal was to separate out those 2 subjects by dividing the current plank in 2 and adding a new title. We don't really need to go over that. That's pretty clear cut. When we start talking about debt, that was a new paragraph with a new title. But also an additional sentence was added to the spending part. And this is a critical change. And I think it helps to clear up a lot of confusion. I don't think it's the only change here needed. And if you look on, let me see what minority report it was that I had supported. Let's look here. I supported the second minority report. Was there 3 on this one? I think I supported the second and the third. Yep. Which went more deeply into being explicit about our position on taxation. But I am very happy with what passed. And here is the sentence that was added to 2.4 at the end. We support any initiative to reduce or abolish any tax and oppose any increase on any tax for any reason. To the extent possible, we advocate that all public services be funded in a voluntary manner. The compromise that was made on the committee was to add that phrase, to the extent possible. And I don't see why anyone should object to that. We can't advocate the impossible. And if it turns out it's not possible, well, then we have to live with that. Libertarianism is not a suicide pact. Moving on. And it's also worth noting at this point, if anyone has been to multiple conventions and this will only be my second one, but I've listened to multiple conventions. I would have to say this, after the procedure for dealing with the multiple minority reports was straightened out, after that point, this has to be one of the smoothest approval processes and general acclamation from the delegates that I had seen in almost any convention. I think our whole committee has every right to be extraordinarily proud of our work. And at the point of Proposal C, what was happening is the committee gave its report. If there were any minority reports, those were presented. We went through the procedure of deciding which one would be voted on. And then when it was time to vote on it, almost immediately someone would call the question and it would pass, like with very little objection to that. And I think licensing might have passed almost unanimously. That is how popular that one was. On a lot of things, there was very, very little debate, and there was a lot of calling the question, and not like obnoxiously. Somebody read the crowd and said, call the question, and people didn't freak out. Remember, it takes a 2/3 vote to be able to call the question. So it meant that there was great support for that. And I don't think any of the calling of the questions, there might have been one, was controversial. So move on to page 11. The next item that passed was to amend Plank 3.2, Internal Security and Individual Rights. The amendment was just to add a sentence to the end, and that sentence was, or is, we oppose the use of torture and other cruel and unusual punishments without exception. If I remember correctly, that was a proposal that was submitted to the committee by a member that we took up and adopted. Don't ever hesitate to submit your suggestions to the platform committees in the future. They should be receptive to them, and several items that were passed were submitted by members. Next, if you go to page 12, Proposal D, which was to amend the preamble. There is nothing particularly substantive here. There was some weird stylistic issues that were changed. You can take a look at it. Nothing I'm really going to go over here. I do think it cleaned it up quite a bit. So let's move on to the next item that was passed, which will be on page 13, which was to amend the current Plank 1.0 personal liberty by adding this sentence at the end. Libertarians reject the notion that groups have inherent rights. We support the rights of the smallest minority, the individual. This was sorely needed. We need to get out of this collectivism and get back to the individual. Unfortunately, that sort of mindset had been indeed creeping into the Libertarian Party. And before anyone objects, no, that's not true, because if Group A contracts with Group B, then Group A does have certain rights when it comes to Group B. Note that the plank is worded inherent rights. Contractual obligations that you take on are not inherent rights. Those are ones that you voluntarily assumed later on. We are talking about born with rights sort of thing, negative rights, inherent negative rights. The next change was also made to Plank 1.0 personal liberty. These were some minor changes, but I think profound ones. The original plank said individuals should be free to make choices for themselves and must accept responsibility for the consequences of the choices they make. Now, that should be, should they be? Why are we being kind of wishy-washy on that? So we changed that to individuals are inherently free. If they are not able to exercise that freedom, it's because they are being constrained. They inherently have that freedom, and it is only through interference that they don't. So that was a great change. And the last sentence had read, no individual, group, or government may initiate force against any other individual, group, or government. It was said, well, but they do. And okay, that's true. They might not have the right to, but they do. But notice that the word used there was may, but I think we've gotten away from the the niceties of what the differences are between can and may. May entails having permission or rightly. But to make that clear, we said no individual, group, or government may rightly initiate force. So if it's done, it is not done in justice or in accordance with rights. All right, if you move on to the following pages, you will see there were multiple proposals having to do with adding provisions for sex work in our platform. And what was adopted is not exactly what was in the report. Here is where some actual amendments happened. If you notice so far, everything was pretty much adopted without amendment. So rather than going through the things in the report, I'll just read what was adopted and give some commentary with that. And this actually deals with two proposed amendments that were two entirely different sections of the platform. One was to add an entirely new plank on sex work and to put it under the economic section of the platform, under Section 2, Economic Liberty, which would then make it clear that this wasn't just, some personal kinky thing or whatever you might think. It was actually a legitimate business. And that was indeed passed as follows. It ended up being plank 2.10, sex work. The Libertarian Party supports the decriminalization of prostitution. We assert the right of consenting adults to provide sexual services to clients for compensation and the right of clients to purchase sexual services from consenting sex workers. This language was recommended to us from people within the sex worker community, and that was very persuasive to the delegates. I will say personally, I'm not personally thrilled with the use of the word decriminalization. I don't think we should be using that. I think it should be legalization. Decriminalization means that, it's still maybe technically illegal, but we're not going to necessarily prosecute it. While legalization can bring in market controls and taxations and regulations, that's just part of being in the market. That is an issue that should be dealt with separately than the actual item being legalized. Because in decriminalization, you are also not providing the same protections that could be in place under legalization. Now, this is just my particular point of view. Obviously, the sex worker community preferred this language. I would prefer legalization language throughout. And also, an amendment was made to 1.7, crime and justice. This is a very interesting section. It got amended several times this convention in very important ways. But where it was amended here, there are multiple important changes that were made to this plank. But let's just deal with the one here having to do with sex work. The 2016 platform in 1.7 in the middle of it said, we favor the repeal of all laws creating crimes without victims, such as the use of drugs for medicinal or recreational purposes. What was added here with regards to sex work, because really there tends to be a trifecta when you start to talk about these victimless crimes. There's gambling, there's sex things, and there's drugs. And that trifecta should be included in here, was our argument, and it, in fact, did pass. As for those who say, well, you should never get specific, well, I think you have to give examples sometimes to show people exactly what you mean and make it clear that the list is not intended to be exhaustive and that the examples you give are like the important, the archetypical examples, if you will. So what it ended up being amended to read now says, we favor the repeal of all laws creating crimes without victims, such as gambling, the use of drugs for medicinal or recreational purposes, and consensual transactions involving sexual services. That, to me, is, hallelujah, a fantastic change. But wait, there's more later. Fantastic changes. Anyway, let's move on and go to page 19. And this is another one that was adopted without amendment. I need to do that research project and going back through convention minutes to see how often that happened, where so many were adopted without amendment. That means that the committee did a good job. I love complimenting this committee. There were some fantastic people on it. And I would love to mention people by name, but then I will neglect to mention somebody. But I am going to mention one person by name, and that is the secretary that helped me. The committee secretary is Mimi, who I just absolutely adore and did such a fantastic job. But everyone absolutely did. So Proposal H, page 19, was to add this phrase. Well, I can't say this, to add a phrase to this plank. And what it did is make it explicit that when we say people should be able to get in any kind of personal relationship that they wish to without government interference, that we're not just talking about gay marriage, and we should not just be stopping with gay marriage. Because the thing is, that's kind of what happened within the the gestalt of the party, that once that happened, we kind of stopped really even arguing about this. We even stopped arguing about the fact that, okay, great, but the government still needs to get out of it. Because what I think libertarians feared is that folks in the gay community would go, oh, now that we finally have this right, now you want it to not be recognized by the government, when in fact that's always been our position. And I think we made a grave mistake in how we handled that whole issue. So I do think we take this up again very well in several amendments that were done at this convention. The past one said, government does not have the authority to define, license, or restrict consensual personal relationships. This was amended to say, government does not have the authority to define, license, or restrict consensual personal relationships regardless of the number of participants. That is huge. That is absolutely huge. I'm not even sure we were that explicit about it in past platforms. I never really researched that, but let me put that on my plate to look at. We might have been. This hasn't always been necessarily my wheelhouse or area of interest, but it has become that since Oglethorpe, because I do think we've dropped the ball here, and that poly is the. If we push the envelope there, I think the whole edifice of the government interfering and controlling personal relationships in the form of marriage will end, because it is impossible to come up with rules and stick the government's sticky fingers in all the different possible combinations and arrangements can be made once you go beyond the typical couple relationship, be it a heterosexual or homosexual couple. Those you can come up with things where you can fit everything maybe in a certain system. The minute you start adding a lot of different people and arrangements, it just does not happen. And, let's burn this thing down, right? And actually, I neglected to mention something here. It was actually the minority report on page 20 that was adopted, which included that phrase. But we also added the word promote in. So government does not have the authority to define, promote, license, or restrict. So they can't go and try to push one form or another. That is up to the people involved, not the state. And we added this sentence at the end, which I know is controversial to some folks. I was the one who championed it, and I will explain why. You can still disagree, but I hope you understand my rationale. And this is coming up on the 30-minute mark, but this one will go a bit over because we do not have much longer, and we need to get this all in one episode, right? So this sentence was added, until such time as the government stops its illegitimate practice of marriage licensing, such licenses must be granted to all consenting adults who apply. That makes it clear that although we begrudgingly accepted this transition step, that is not our goal. And notice this is worded to the effect that a single person could even apply to get married to themselves. They consent, right? Want to show the ludicrousness of the government being able to say yes to some and no to others. We need to like with the poly thing. I've had some people go, oh, well, you're not going to win on that issue. And, that just makes me want to gouge out my eye. But in the 70s, when we championed gay rights, that was not a winning issue either. But we did it because it was the right thing to do. And we should be championing the rights of poly people, which also do affect the GSM community, in that GSM being, from what I understand, the term that's becoming popular in the party rather than LGBTQ is GSM, gendered and sexual minorities. So it includes everyone that would fall within that, rather than adding a million letters and plus and minus and exclamation points. I think that's much simpler. Boy, I think I went off on a tangent. I don't even know what I was saying. So let me get back to my point here. In promoting poly people, it is further going on the next step in promoting GSM rights, because the fact is, forcing people into only a couple relationship is not everyone's preference or composition or the way they wish to live their lives. And right now they are a minority, the people that wish to do that. And we champion the rights of the smallest minority, which is the individual. And it should not matter whether or not that is, quote, a winning issue or not. In a discussion on things such as this in the past, I'm not going to say who the discussion was with, or it was on a different issue, but this is more about the principle. When I asked, why aren't we defending X? I was told that you don't lead by your chin. Mark Montoni said in response, and I'll never forget it, he said, sometimes that's the only way you can lead. And I absolutely agree with that. The old ACLU, not the new ACLU, the old ACLU used to understand that they would defend the free speech rights of the most abhorrent speakers, because they realize that that's where the erosion begins. Defending the right does not mean that you are defending the words. And since the ACLU has dropped that ball, I do think it's incumbent upon us to pick it up and run with it. It's a shame that we have very little true uncompromising defense of civil liberties in this day and age. And yes, that does mean you don't have to bake the Nazi cake or any other kind of cake. You have absolutely no right to the services of another person. You move on to page 21 to Proposal I. These are additional changes to Plank 1.7 that I spoke about earlier. There were amendments made to this. And the first thing you'll notice is that it also included the gambling and sexual services language here. And that was done in case it wasn't reached in the earlier discussion or proposals, in case a certain minority report or other was heard. We still wanted that to be considered, but that no longer was an issue as that was passed. And where the controversy came up here, we're going to divide it into the two separate sections of controversy. The first part is in, I think it was 2016, this first sentence was changed, and it says the prescribed role of government is to protect the rights of every individual, including the right to life, liberty, and property. That is very, 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 very problematic, because it seems or could be interpreted that the party was saying there is a prescription, a prescribed role. In the past, we were able to say that this plank was a description and not a prescription. Prescribing government violates the Dallas Accord. So since all planks must be in conformity with the statement of principles, we have to be very careful in the way that we word this. So we had suggested that that sentence be struck and instead say, libertarians believe that government force must be limited to the protection of the rights of individuals to life, liberty, and property, and governments must never be permitted to violate these rights. That does the same thing that the statement of principles does. It's in complete conformity with it. It assigns no necessary positive role, and the only role it potentially assigns is defensive, which is the only legitimate use of force. But if you are violating rights in the use of that force, then it is no longer legitimate. What ended up being passed was that exact language, with the exception of the introductory words, libertarians believe that. It was felt by the delegates that it was stronger just to say government force must be, not that we believe it. Obviously, we believe it. It's in our platform. I understand that. One argument was made that all of our planks should start with libertarians believe that, because the platform is very rarely read in its entirety, and it very often is quoted in the media and such. And if we had libertarians believe that at the beginning of each, it further spreads the L word, and it's kind of a marketing ploy, but other people did not agree with that, and that is perfectly acceptable. And it does, with libertarians, it sounds stronger. I'm not so sure it would sound weaker, but to say that to the outside world, but hey, that's how it goes. And there is just one more that was adopted, which was Proposal L, which is on page. I'm scrolling to it, doing this live. You get to hear me improvise and sing terribly, make a joyful noise. Okay, here we go. Page 32. Amend Plank 2.6, Money and Financial Markets. This was the other item that was submitted by the membership. In fact, it was submitted by Mr. Sarwark, who left the chair to position to go to the floor to argue this and handed the gavel over to Mr. Vora to handle. And that was to insert these words into that section. We support ending federal student loan guarantees and special treatment of student loan debt in bankruptcy proceedings. I'm so glad that passed. This is the solution that we need that will appeal to the young people that really are under the devastating burden of these kinds of debt. They should be just as dischargeable as any other debt. While libertarians in general might not agree with bankruptcy, if there is to be bankruptcy laws, and I haven't examined this enough to personally know what my opinion would be in Libertopia. What we are dealing with is the world as it is now. If there are bankruptcy laws, it cannot discriminate against certain types of loans. And these are ones in which the fact that they cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, that fact is used to absolutely exploit and capitalize and capitalize isn't the wrong way. Well, capitalize on an opportunity to raise prices, and it's basically a riskless investment. I mean, if you could give out money that that your risk was very, very low because it was guaranteed and it could not be discharged in bankruptcy, there's a lot of incentive to do that. And not only that, to do it at the highest rate. If you knew, however, that if you charge too much, it will drive the person into bankruptcy and you will get nothing. That is the market at work, more so than having these special privileges of exemptions given for this particular type of debt. And in fact, tax debt needs to not have a special circumstance either. Why does the government get to protect its own assets? I was going to say its own assets. All righty. That is it for the items that were passed. And they weren't huge. what I mean by huge is it wasn't these massive, complicated things. It was just tweaks here and there that were needed. And there are a few more that are needed. I'm going to release as a bonus episode to patrons only my discussion on the items that were not passed but considered, and the items that we didn't get to, and perhaps some items that just didn't make it out of committee that I think should have. That maybe will be brought up next year. So that will be the special bonus for those of you who decide to become patrons of this show. And I cannot tell you how much that would mean to me. It honestly would. I'm starting to move towards a stage in my life where, I have the talent and research in my my heart and my passion is in education of the principles of liberty. And if I could do this, God, my dream would be full-time, but even more time than I do now if I was able to do half-time doing it, half-time at a, normie job and, half-time at doing this, pay fantastic. But if that doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So please consider becoming a patron, and also please consider leaving an iTunes review. And next thing that we will be talking about, maybe, I think I'll ask for your opinions on the next thing that we'll be talking about, and I'll also be posting this in the patrons group. But let me go to my notes and see some ideas I had for future episodes. And you'll note that in some of the patron tiers that I give priority to certain patron levels to submit subjects to be considered. Everyone's will be considered eventually. It's just a perk if you have a specific question. And if it's something that I don't think I can answer, patron or not, I don't tackle something that I don't think I can competently address. So in my notes, these are the subjects I was considering. I'd love to know your thoughts on them. No particular order. And that is radical methodology. You might have heard of no particular orderism. If you heard me on the Tom Woods show, I spoke about that a little bit, and I'd like to get into it in more detail. Or how about why anarchy? Why political anarchy? How about discussion of the differences of positive and negative rights and how that sets apart libertarianism from other political systems? I would like to also delve into the difference between morality and justice. They are not the same thing, and libertarianism can be quite incomprehensible until you grok that particular difference. I wanted to also deal with my proposition, my personal view that the true pragmatists are radical. That's a controversial statement, but I'd like to get into that. There is also, and yeah, I don't even want to get into that more. There's a whole thing that I can do to give you guys at least food for thought on that particular subject. I would like to discuss abortion and the Libertarian Party. I would like to discuss our very shallow understanding of the non-aggression principle. And this way we promote it sometimes causes people to reject it, but they're not really rejecting it. They're rejecting a shadow of it. The NAP by itself is not enough. It is absolutely not enough, and we need to learn that. That is not a rejection of the NAP. It is a completion of the NAP. And then, as I had mentioned, I think it was the last episode, I wanted to deal with this whole idea that was brought forth by the Reform Caucus, and I think done so in a misleading way and corrected by the Radical Caucus of there's more than one way to be a libertarian. And there absolutely is. It's just that it was misapplied in 2006. So I would love to know your thoughts on any of these. And until next time, or if I catch you in the patron-only link, have an awesome day. Mi guapas de libertad.
Thank you for listening to The Big L, where size does matter. Subscribe today and help support the show by going to BigLPodcast.com. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
I must take this time to disseminate the appropriate disclaimers and advisories. If it pleases the Crown, While I am an officer of the National Libertarian Party and have in fact sold my soul to the blessed chicken on a stick, all opinions, perspectives, rants, jokes, and outbursts of any and all kinds are solely me speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of the party. I am not the party spokesperson, just a fanatic who happens to hold a position. Before anything else, I am a liberty activist, just like you. And if you call me a politician, I die a little inside. Thank you.